I think people really, really believe that a trans kid, quote unquote, is a fundamentally very different kind of person, and that it's not really up to the therapist to question or understand or explore or challenge. It's like the person sitting in front of me is like a special unicorn. I can't possibly understand their experience, and so therefore I have to let them teach me.
Oftentimes, if you are gay, that can then cause lots of issues in your life. But then with trans, sometimes it's the other way around. So sometimes it's all the issues in your life are leading to this trans identity. So in some ways, they're like mirror opposites in that sense, you know? All right, Sasha Ayad, thank you so much. Welcome to the podcast. You're welcome to be here.
Thank you. I'm really glad to finally chat with you. I've been really enjoying your channel, and I've also watched how much it's changed and grown over the years. So it's really cool. And
oh my gosh, no way.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I followed you much more recently, but then, you know, whenever I see somebody doing interesting things on YouTube, I love to go back and see where it started, because usually you see a channel has evolved and like the aesthetics have really changed and your equipment has gotten better. So I love to watch like the earlier on videos and kind of catch up, because people don't realize like what a process it is to, I mean, my YouTube channel is very, very tiny, but like I'm amazed watching people's YouTube channels grow and change and evolve. So anyway, glad to be here.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think anyone who does the same thing can probably see with these topics my journey in terms of understanding things and conclusions I've sort of reached or things I'm still unsure about. And they would definitely see mistakes I've made in terms of when I've gone too far in my opinions and, you know, stuff like that. So,
yeah, it's a learning process. I mean, this is one of the most complicated and twisted and convoluted subjects. So it's very easy to, I mean, I've changed my mind about lots of things. I've learned a lot over the years. So I totally get it.
Yeah. Well, yeah, looking forward to getting into that today. So, hopefully, most of my audience will be familiar with you. I first came across you because of the Gender A Wider Lens podcast, and you and Stella O'Malley made a big announcement today about that. So we can go into that at some point. But you are a licensed therapist based in Arizona, and you're obviously very familiar with all of these gender topics. And I know that it weaves into your professional life too. How about we just start with your background and when exactly did your life sort of U-turn into gender?
Yeah, it's interesting when I'm asked this question, I never know exactly where to start, but I guess I'll say that, you know, I've always been very interested in human psychology. I started college thinking I was going to go to medical school because I love the process of caring for people and healing. And I'm very interested in like physiology and the body and like sports and things like that. So I thought I was going to be a doctor or a physician of some kind. But I ended up finding psychology really interesting. So I started to study psychology after a couple of years of pre-med, and then ended up going to graduate school to study counseling psychology. And throughout that time, you know, I always had my eye on, you know, for lack of a better phrase, marginalized communities. I was always really interested in taking courses about race and sexuality and sexual orientation and gender and things like that. So I kind of had my mind primed in somewhat of like a social justice orientation from pretty early on. But when I was training in graduate school, the concept of a transgender child, for example, just did not exist. You know, we were trained a little bit, or we got a few paragraphs here and there about adults who transition or transsexuals, but like the concept of a trans kid didn't really exist. And then, you know, I worked with autism for a long time. I worked with adults who have disabilities. I worked as a sexual abuse and domestic violence counselor. And then I also was working in a middle school around the mid 2010s when this stuff really kind of caught my attention. And I was working in a school that was predominantly, you know, lots of immigrant families, minority families, low income families. And in our particular campus of, you know, middle school and high school students, there weren't lots of kids who were questioning their gender identity. But I did start our school's first GSA, or Gay Straight Alliance, at the time. So I was leading these meetings, and I was, you know, online reading about some of this gender stuff. I had seen like National Geographic magazine talking about the gender revolution. So like these concepts were beginning to be in the air socially. So when I led our GSA meetings, I always tried to be really careful about the kinds of lessons that we did together. I tried to focus more on, things like self-acceptance around your sexual orientation and things like that. And I tried to always steer away from things getting too much into like gender identity labels. But of course, kids in my club were coming in and saying things like, oh, I saw online on Tumblr these like gender bracelets where you put on a different bracelet to indicate what gender you are that day. And they were talking about things like breast binders and all of these concepts that I thought, gosh, this is really unusual. And it kind of made me go further and further online trying to research this. And of course, what really caught my attention in a big way was finding parent forums who were had moms and dads basically saying, my kid has never really struggled with gender so much. Out of the blue, she announced that she's trans and she's been struggling with other mental health issues. And when I took her to a therapist, they said, you have to affirm her immediately or she's going to kill herself. And then parents were saying, we're also being told we have to get our kid on puberty blockers or we should stop her period using the pill, like medical interventions. So there was like all of this stuff I was seeing. And initially, when I was hearing about the pronoun bracelets or whatever, I thought, okay, maybe kids are just experimenting with new ways of being gender nonconforming or being kind of androgynous. But then I realized that this was also tipping into like body modifications and interventions and doctors and therapists like rushing along with it very, very quickly. And I just thought, gosh, this is not the way we typically treat adolescents who are going through identity exploration. And they're maybe taking some risks or maybe they want some crazy things. But adults are not supposed to be like, yeah, here, take the drugs, here, take the breast binder. So, I immediately thought something was strange about this. And around that time, I did have a couple of kids that I had known for, at that point, maybe a year or two, who started saying things like, I don't think I want to be a girl anymore, or I think I'd like to start using a breast binder. And so I had like both the kind of cultural piece that I was watching through these online places and in my club, and then also some individual students who began struggling with these issues. And in the case of, one particular kid I'm thinking about, we already had this really good relationship from before she started to question her gender. And I basically just tried to encourage her to embrace her own quirks. You don't have to wear, you don't have to change your identity to be yourself. And of course, I talked to her about how you can't believe everything you see on Tumblr. And I talked about the safety and not safety of breast binding. And so in this one case, I saw how in the course of 6 months or so, she went from like, I don't think I'm a girl and I need a breast binder to accepting herself and realizing that this was really about other stuff. She made some friends at school and she just kind of moved on. So all of that culminated with me thinking, okay, if parents don't have someone to help their children move through this kind of with curiosity and gentleness, maybe I can start in private practice and support these kids. And so I started private practice in 2016. And since then, that's exclusively what I've been doing, is working with young people who are questioning their gender, teenagers and young adults. And I have learned a ton along the way. And I would do parent coaching. I do a lot of stuff trying to help families basically slow down and look at this gender identity questioning with a little more nuance and not such a black and white rigid way. Like if you're questioning your gender, it means you have to transition. I think there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah. Thank you for that. One thing that intrigues me with this is how many therapists have succumbed to the black and white frame of thinking, because I even did a introduction to counseling course because I was interested in the subject. And obviously, the starting point is sort of a neutral exploratory place and not necessarily affirming, your counselee's ideas about certain things or disagreeing with them. But what do you think? For you, how come you noticed that there was something different about this straight away. And what are your thoughts about all these therapists who go through this training, who are supposed to kind of understand neutrality, that have fallen into that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are lots of different factors that probably impact that dynamic. I mean, on one hand, like I said to you, I always was curious about studying, people who are in somewhat of a marginalized situation. And I know that, in college, I had a lot of gay friends and lesbian friends. And I knew for a fact that lots of adult lesbians probably have gender dysphoria and like struggle sometimes with their bodies. Like I knew a lot of lesbians would wear sports bras and sometimes even chest flatteners because they struggled with these feelings of discomfort in their bodies. But the solution was not to take testosterone and try and become men. So like I already had kind of friendships and relationships with people who probably had gender dysphoria. Even for myself in my own teenage years, and I sometimes say sorting through my own sexuality, but that's not even the right word. I think I have gone through various evolutions in my own experiences of like attraction and who do I find attractive and what makes them attractive. And so I know that teenagers can have some confusing experiences around sexuality and your relationship to your body and masculinity and femininity and all these things. So, and it's also like my personality is very, least invasive first thinking. So I'm very interested in helping clients be curious about themselves and accept weird things about themselves without having to fix it, right? And so this is true for lots of things. As a therapist, I've always been quite hesitant about quickly getting a diagnosis and sending someone to a psychiatrist. Like only in the most extreme cases do I think diagnosis and medical intervention is the best approach. So some of this is like my own personality, my own backstory, my own experiences. And also I just kept thinking, a lot of these criteria that we use to diagnose gender dysphoria sounds a lot like gay and lesbian friends that I've had, or it can sound like someone who's having a hard time accepting that they are somewhat nonconforming. And why not focus on making space for that and accepting that rather than my body is the problem. I have to fit better into society as a cis person or, try to make myself look like a quote cis person. So I think I just had a lot of skepticism about the idea of transforming your body to make your mind feel better.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of therapists who quickly buy into it, I've really thought about this a lot, Jack. And
subscribe to my Substack, Jack Jewell Uncut. This is where you will get my full, uncut, untamed, and unashamed takes too controversial for YouTube, including early access to all videos, a private members chat where you can talk to me, and bonus footage seen nowhere else, including this episode.
I have really tried to understand the autogynephilia phenomenon. I think that, and Scarlett tells us this story of meeting like an older MTF, and he didn't know the word autogynephilia, by the way.
People who are surgeons, who are trans women themselves, it creates all sorts of disturbing questions around performing these surgeries. What are they getting out of that?
Yeah.
Do you have a consensus right now on whether there's any place for this medicalization?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Link on screen and in the description.
I think people really, really believe that a trans kid, quote unquote, is a fundamentally very different kind of person, and that it's not really up to the therapist to question or understand or explore or challenge. It's like the person sitting in front of me is like a special, special unicorn, and I can't possibly understand their experience. And so therefore I have to let them teach me, about what it means to be trans and what it means to have a different gender identity. And frankly, I mean, there are, some of the pioneers in gender medicine, quote unquote, who really advocate for lowering the ages for intervention or removing barriers to access to care. I'm using air quotes here. they have been
Yeah.
precisely saying that, like, let your patient teach you about being trans. Like, we should listen to the children. And you even see sometimes these, documentaries or clips about the transgender child, quote unquote, and they're interviewing like a 4-year-old boy, and they're like, so what do you think you are on the inside? And he's like, I'm a little girl or whatever. And it's like,
Yeah.
whoa, like we are treating a young person who has a material disconnect from reality as though they have some magic understanding or magic information, and that the rest of us are just going to like kind of huddle around the kid and be like, wow, that's amazing. Tell us more about your little girl living on the inside. Like I think it's a kind of intriguing, fantastical idea that a person can have a different person living inside of them. I mean, I think some people find it quite amazing and like, you just, it's like a curiosity about something unusual. It's almost metaphysical, right? It's like a spiritual thing. So I don't know. I mean, I think some therapists are probably intimidated by all the activist backlash against questioning people's identity. So there's the fear factor piece, but then some people are probably just like, wow, this sounds amazing and magical. I want to know more about people trapped in the wrong body. Like I'd love to be an advocate for those people. So there's lots of different reasons, I think. But from the beginning, I thought, gosh, any belief system that puts a child at odds with their own body and makes them medicalize it forever, that can't possibly be just like an optimal health, just a variation of human experience. Like that can't possibly be. Like I really think our health is so precarious. We should do everything we can to protect it. You live once. That's what I think. So just any belief system that puts you at odds with your body, I was just like very skeptical of that.
Yeah. Yeah. You touched on a few things there I think is really interesting. And I think with all of this trans ideology, I mean, it's sort of one topic, but just the amount of stuff you have to untease and learn about all of these different things, and in terms of the political aspect, in terms of the psychological aspect, in terms of the different presentations of this phenomenon. And I think based off people wanting to, like you said, imagine the trans child as this other type of human, I think it shows just how great the activist charities have managed to sort of appropriate the gay narrative into the trans one, right? Because we decided as society, okay, gay people are born this way, and whether they are or not, it's sort of accepted more widely that they can't change their sexual orientation, that there's nothing they can do about it, really. So, I mean, I think it's both quite wicked, but also very impressive how the movement has managed this kind of top-down approach and sort of piggybacking off different things and getting policies in through the back door when it comes to the legislation. But the fact that they've sort of now got a lot of society to think, well, being trans is like being gay. It's just part of the umbrella. But then it's just the two things couldn't be further apart, right? Because I would imagine if I'm a therapist and I had a 15-year-old boy come in and say, I'm gay and my life is really difficult, I suppose accepting the fact he is gay wouldn't necessarily be anywhere near as risky as just accepting the fact that he thinks he's a girl, right? But they're two very different things. And then something else I noticed is oftentimes if you are gay, that can then cause lots of issues in your life. But then with trans, sometimes it's the other way around. So sometimes it's all the issues in your life are leading to this trans identity. So in some ways, they're like mirror opposites in that sense,
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's so much that you just said that is super important. I think that is one of the biggest misconceptions that the lay person, the normie who hasn't delved into this, doesn't understand. And I was just speaking with somebody yesterday who is already a heterodox thinker. She's gay herself and she's really open-minded, but she had never heard of or considered the possibility that some young gay kids are identifying as trans because they don't like being gay. Like that blew her mind. And I'm like, oh, this is actually like the entire foundation of pediatric gender medicine is taking mostly gay kids who are ambivalent about being gay and turning them into the quote unquote, turning them into the opposite sex. So like that's a big misnomer. And actually, on the podcast, we interviewed Glenna Goldis recently. She's an attorney, a lesbian in New York. And she went to the Supreme Court where there's a big case here in the US happening called Scrimetti. And it's basically about whether or not individual states can ban puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones for minors, whether or not it's constitutional. And she, along with many other gay, lesbian, and bisexual people, were in front of the Supreme Court, with posters and trying to communicate various things. And a lot of the mainstream media that came to just cover all of the different demonstrations had never heard of this idea that many people arguably think we're transing away the gay in a lot of these kids. And so, mainstream publications that are reporting on this have done exactly what you described, Jack, which is like, this is just gay 2.0. Like if we accepted gay people, then we just have to accept the declaration of trans kids, so to speak. And there's just so much that people don't quite understand about like the more psychological intricacies of this. And it's, I think part of what makes this so complicated is on a public kind of declarations level, a lot of societies, especially Western societies, have been much more accepting of things like gay marriage. For example, here it's legal in the United States for gay people to get married. And that wasn't the case for decades and decades. So it looks as though the barriers for gay people being gay and accepting themselves as gay are gone. Like it's totally easy now. So if a child has same-sex attraction and claims instead to be trans, I think a lot of people assume, well, they mustn't have internalized homophobia because that's old. Like that's from the 50s. Like we don't have that anymore. But that's not how human psychology works. That's not how it works when you're 12 and 13 and you got an erection sitting next to your best guy friend and you're mortified and you're like, oh my God, he's going to think I'm disgusting. And you hear your dad make a kind of homophobic joke and you get that in your brain. Like all of that stuff happens even in a liberal accepting society. And so individual identity development is subject to so many forces and it's subtle and it's nuanced. And so even in the example you gave, like if a kid tells a therapist I'm gay, like actually it's usually not that cut and dry. Like a lot of kids are just trying to figure out, what does it mean that I had this dream the other night? Like this wet dream, like what does that mean about me? And, lots of kids these days are claiming various labels, right? We know that something like 20% of kids identify as some sort of LGBTQ. But many of those, in my experience, have just kind of like read a bunch of labels online and have adopted one. Most of them have no real life sexual experience. They've never kissed somebody. They don't know what it feels like to own your sexuality in an embodied, mature way. Like you just found a cool flag on Tumblr. Like that doesn't mean you accept your sexuality. You know what I mean? So these things are really complicated and there's a lot to unpick. And as a therapist, I think that the greatest fraud of all this gender identity stuff is the way it shuts down curiosity. When you have a person, a human being sitting in front of you, and your job is to get to know them really well. If you start having a framework in your mind that blocks off your ability to ask interesting questions or try to understand the deeper meaning or read between the lines, you can't possibly help that person, no matter what they're struggling with, gender or otherwise. So this idea that like a person makes a claim about trans and you have to run with it immediately, it shuts down all the avenues of curiosity, inquiry, discussion, and that leads people astray. And I think that's precisely why we see so many detransitioners who are like, I was 14. I had just been hospitalized for a suicide attempt. I had an eating disorder. Nobody thought to ask me why I didn't want to be a girl anymore and cut my breasts off. Like nobody wanted to slow down and ask me about that. So we are really doing a disservice to these kids.
I love what you touched on there in terms of people assuming that this homophobic concept has been and gone, Yeah, I think it's dangerous to assume that to be the case because, it's kind of upsetting for me with experiences I've had personally and all the pushback I get naturally as you would imagine from talking about this stuff, especially in sometimes the way I do, which is very opinionated and direct. And I suppose for me that comes from a motivation of feeling quite devastated on what's happened to so many gay kids and what has happened to this movement because I'm only 30 and just 15 years ago I was living in Ireland and I was still terrified of even talking about the fact I was gay. I grew up with this incessant need to try and appear straight acting and masculine. And then when I moved here to the UK to go to drama school, that goal became even stronger because I desperately worried about being able to play a straight role, if you know what I mean. So I was always trying to decampify myself, defeminize myself. And I think it's frustrating for me trying to converse with people about this when they won't entertain the gender dysphoria coming from sexuality narrative, both on a personal level, because I feel like, there wasn't much time in society where being gay was kind of just like, okay, we're good now. Before then, this just took over. It was almost no time at all.
Yeah.
So now I feel like in my life, I've kind of gone from being terrified of talking about being gay to now being a complete transphobe that people don't want to talk to. So it's sort of like there's never really been a happy middle. I think something that I try and discuss a lot with people and tell people about is even if you're gay and you're not abused or bullied, or even if people accept you for who you are, when you're a kid, you desperately want to feel part of something. You want to fit in with the clique. And if you're the only gay in the village, as it were, or in your classroom, that can be really difficult because you feel like there is no one of you in terms of, whether you're one of the girls, if you're a girl, whether you're one of the guys, if you're a guy. And sitting in that gray space can be really unsettling.
Yeah.
I mean, I know from my experience, I didn't face loads of bullying. I had quite a bit. I was always sad that I could never be fully part of the girls I was friends with. There was always something missing. Like they would go off and have their sleepovers without me. They would have girls' days. And I had no frame of reference to do with gender. So I have no idea what kind of thoughts I would have had if things were different. But it's like that gender dysphoria is giving the kids a framework to try and solve some of their issues, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really important. And I'm curious about that sense of identity development and how, I'm somewhat skeptical of the argument that's made about media and stuff that says like representation is how we understand ourselves. Like, for example, that you have to see certain people in the media that are exactly like you in order to connect with that character or whatever. But when it comes to identity development as we're getting older, over and over again, when I look at, the experiences of gay and lesbian people, and I look at the literature about identity development, it's crucial for people to understand that they do have a place where they fit in, and it is perfectly fine to be in that kind of different gender space. Like by definition, being same-sex attracted means you are going to operate in a different way than males and then females, right? So this is the nuance that I think you're touching on. And I've said this too on our show and in other places, like we've never really had a period of time where the nuances of what it means to be a same-sex attracted person just have place to like be in society, and for society to get comfortable with and understand, and for gay people to get comfortable with themselves. And it's the thing about activism too. It has to be very public facing, very showy. And it's like, okay, we have gay pride parades. Great. Okay. Gay marriage is legalized. Great. But on individual levels, how does an individual gay person understand their place in their family? If you are the only gay person for miles and miles around, how do you have a sense of like, I can be comfortable and own myself without a sense of community or a sense of mentorship or like older gay men to help you understand these dynamics and these relationships with your female friends, with your straight male friends, with your gay male friends, like with lovers? Like these are all different dynamics.
Mm-hmm.
And you can't just bypass that quickly because gay marriage was legalized. Like that's not the same thing.
Yeah. And also coming to terms with the fact that, you may never have biological children, or if you do have children, it's going to be a lot more complicated. That's a very big thing to come to terms with. I don't know whether that would be a bigger journey for young women than young men, because obviously, but you know, as we learn with kids being trans, they often, you know, their mind is so far from thinking about kids. But I know for me, when I was, you know, 12, 13, I was still in the mindset of wanting to have a family one day. And I used to tell myself, oh, it's okay, I'll just hide it and, you know, be with a woman eventually. Obviously, after a couple of years,
Oh.
I was thinking to myself,
Wow.
God, you sounded crazy thinking that, you know, I never actually wanted them to do that. But yeah, it's a very complicated, sexuality is a very complicated thing to untease when you're not the conventional one. And I really hope as we move forward in this conversation and more people become aware of what's going on, you know, what's happened to kids, that maybe that will open up an avenue. And it makes me wonder too, you know, is it just coincidence that this trans stuff came on, which sort of has regressed us back into these stereotypes and homophobia? Or it makes me wonder, you know, will homophobia always be this kind of thing we have to keep at bay, you know, presenting in various forms?
I've thought about that a lot, and I remember kind of asking similar questions. I do think that our collective subconscious, whatever that may be, is really uncomfortable with extreme gender nonconformity because it does
Mm-hmm.
make a person stand out compared to the norm. And I think
Mm-hmm.
society will always, intentionally or not, create forces that keep pushing that gender nonconformity towards more conforming appearances. And I do think that this is very much part of what's going on here.
Yeah.
And
agree.
I'm curious, like, it's interesting because I think if anybody in this, you know, debate has kind of ground to stand on, it is gay and lesbian adults who can speak from their own personal experiences, and still you get a lot of pushback. So I'd love to hear, like, what is the common pushback that you get when you try to talk about this, even coming from your own experience of having this like embodied and informed experience of like how gay kids might get caught up in this? What's the pushback that you typically get?
Yeah, we'll have to make sure the interview doesn't get switched around, because I know that you're such a curious person.
I know. Okay.
No, don't worry. I want to answer it. Well, I guess the unfortunate answer to that question is it's often not very imaginative or deep. It's typically, you know, you are a cis white male and you don't understand the experience, and that then it kind of stops there, you know.
Yeah.
You know, they say the rate of regret is minuscule. You're overinflating it, and you know this is not the case with trans people. You just don't understand their experience. So I would say that's large. It kind of devolves straight down to identity politics, and it's you are not this thing, therefore you can't have an opinion on this thing. Or they say that I'm full of misinformation. You know, it's really difficult. I can, with online hate, it doesn't faze me at all. You know, most of these are faceless people, and I've heard everything now, but it's difficult. And I'm lucky to have lots of support, a supportive partner, all this kind of stuff. But it's difficult to kind of accept the fact that some people see you as some sort of a conspiracy theorist and extremist. Whereas in actual fact, sometimes conspiracies turn out to be true. And this one in particular is so complicated. And when you kind of put all the breadcrumbs together on where this concept of gender identity began, like when did the politics get involved? When did WPATH get created? When the perfect storm. It's taken me almost 2 years to get a good view of all this. And that's coming from someone who spends all his free time listening to podcasts, reading books. So of course, your average person off the street is not just gonna sort of maybe entertain all these ideas straight away, or they might think, "Wow, you sound insane." You know, this is not. This sounds like conspiracy theory, and then you go into like autogynephilia and all this stuff. It's very intense for someone who's not heard it all. So
yeah.
yeah.
It gets really, really messy really fast. And I mean, it's one of those things that the more I learn about it, the more crazy it actually turns out to be, which is very rare. Like usually the more you learn about something, you're like, oh, okay, I get it now. But this is like the more you learn about it, you're like, how is that possible? you know? But I do think like something I've learned over the years, we have gone deep down the well of all of the intricate, back channel WPATH meetings and this and that. But I think the simplest thing that I think people should hear is that, when you immediately affirm a child's gender confusion and you medicalize it, you are likely sterilizing that child. And like, that's such a simple thing. And you don't even need to talk about WPATH or the money behind the movement. All you have to do is say, did you know that? And I remember talking to somebody who, she's my hairdresser, stylist, and she's very, very progressive. She's she's really into like rational thinking and all this stuff. And it blew her mind to learn that. And she was like, almost like, oh my God, do trans kids know that? Like, she couldn't believe that was true. And I'm like, oh, yeah. I mean, there's entire workshops about fertility preservation for children because this is a known side effect. So there are some simple things that I think those of us who fell down the well can get so distracted with all of these super complicated and very hard to understand things. But the simplest thing is like, we are taking away these children's future possibilities for love and sexual pleasure and fertility and all of these things. And like, I have to remind myself all the time, don't get in the weeds. Just like talk about the simple kind of like massive human rights violations that are happening here. And then, beyond that, there's always interesting things to discuss, but that's like a basic.
Yeah, I agree. I think some people I talk to, that's, they're satisfied with that information and they're not really for child transition.
I always try to be curious and give people the benefit of the doubt. But of course, you can't help but notice. I mean, somebody like Norman Spack, who's an endocrinologist who brought the Dutch protocol of puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones to the US, he talks explicitly, openly in a TED Talk about how, when he learned that you could block the puberty of kids to help them transition, he said, I was salivating at the idea of that. And he, in his TED Talk, like parades this boy that he helped to transition and shows that like, if I hadn't intervened hormonally, this person, she quote unquote, would have been 6 feet tall. But look at her now. Look at this beautiful girl I created. Like, it's like being a sculptor and being like a Frankenstein doctor. And like, there's so many aspects of it that I find disturbing. And to be fair, like I really want to represent all, I guess, generous interpretations. When you look back, like I watched a film a while ago about like medicine in the 30s or something. And if you look back at procedures that we do that are standard now, of course, they went through many iterations of like very, very brave, quote unquote, doctors who were willing to risk patients' lives to perfect techniques that eventually would become solid and safe. So in the most generous interpretation, perhaps we might say that in 50 years, gender medicine and all these hormonal interventions and stuff will be so much safer and so much better managed, and trans people will be able to transition with less health complications and all that. But, my instinct says there's only so far we can get away from nature without severely jeopardizing our health. And there's no denying that male physiology, like your healthy hormone levels and my healthy hormone levels, are totally different because you are male and I am female. And there's no technology that can overcome that very, very basic distinction that is what creates every single mammalian species on the planet for thousands and thousands of years. So, I'm always trying to debate myself. Like, am I wrong here? Am I just being short-sighted? Am I just like a science advancement denier? And I always have to come back to that. Like, our entire body system operates on a very delicate balance of a million different things. Like your blood cell count is off, your estrogen and testosterone levels are off, your whatever. I don't know. I'm not a physician, but it's all so precise that if we start messing with this,
yeah,
I don't know how we can call that healthy.
Yeah, I think about this so much, particularly lately. I think, how with these Dutch protocol people, did they consider, so, a male is supposed to have testosterone. So what's going to happen if we remove that testosterone forever from his body? And I met some therapists at GenSpect who were talking to me about their patient profile. So I don't know if this is something you see, but they said in general, the male to female patients they see, and of course, these might be people who are particularly struggling. So you have to kind of take that into account. But just, I guess, those males who have nuked their testosterone, they seem to struggle more than the female to males who, I don't know, potentially have a hormone in their system, which is actually sort of giving them a lift rather than removing. But I mean, even in quote unquote cis males, you might have a condition that gives you lower testosterone, and the symptoms are, brain fog, poor sleep, depression, anxiety, lack of concentration. Those are not great things. So my impression is, in the trans woman, we're actually inducing that. And that leads me on to the speculation of looking at some trans women in the media, like India Willoughby, who have become consistently more and more sort of spiraling down this path of derangement and vendetta and just kind of losing the plot. I wonder if no testosterone in their body is causing some of these issues of decline,
Wow, that's such an interesting question. And this is why it would be so great if more physicians, professionals, therapists were allowed to be curious. I mean, these are very valid questions. How do these hormonal interventions impact people? This raises a very interesting question. And, to be fair, I've worked with many more females than I have males. So this is anecdotal, just based on observations, but something that I hear a lot in, for example, forums of MTFs who are curious about pursuing testosterone blockers and estrogen. Many of them feel really overwhelmed by their sex drives.
Yeah.
We sometimes hear about the incel to trans pipeline, which is really interesting. If you are a male who's young and you are totally overwhelmed by an erection coming out of nowhere or doing things, whether by yourself or with others that you find overwhelming and like you feel like you've lost control, I think that blocking testosterone in a way can have almost a relieving effect for some people. Now,
Right.
of course, What's the long-term impact of that? I mean, that's puberty, right? Like we go through puberty, and of course I'm female, so I don't know what it's like to be a boy going through puberty, but we've been hearing this for generations that boys going through puberty are overwhelmed by sexual urges and feelings and drives they have no idea how to control. They have no idea what to make of. So I think sometimes I wonder, if there's this weird way that some young people are kind of like medically managing this overwhelming drive. Now, I don't think it's healthy, and I don't think it's the right solution in the long run. But again, if we're allowed to be curious and we're not going to just say, this is always bad, there's nothing good that ever happens from this. Like, I bet on an individual level, it does feel good to be like, I have some relief from this like terrifying force that was overcoming me. So I'm curious about that.
Yeah.
But yes, of course, in the long run, blocking testosterone and taking estrogen creates all kinds of mood issues, all kinds of depression symptoms can be part of it. So it's a huge question that we don't know. And I want to touch on something else you raised about whether these quote pioneers of pediatric gender medicine even considered that like a male is supposed to have a certain amount of testosterone. We just spoke with a woman in the Netherlands who was discussing how she made this really poignant observation that a lot of the pioneers also had worked with DSDs. So like they come from a background where people's hormone levels and biological, clarity as male or female was already really fuzzy. So perhaps that kind of primed them to say, well, none of this is real anyway. Like I've been working with patients. Let's say you had really worked with DSD patients for 5 years, 10 years. Your brain is primed to see people as nothing but like almost like an audio engineer, like levels go up, levels go down, surgery does this, surgery does that. But of course, that is completely unique and distinct from somebody like you or somebody that like me who's unambiguously got one biological sex, and our health is completely determined on this fine balance.
Yeah.
So I have no idea, but that feels very, very important. Like all of these guys, like the John Moneys and the, who else? Harry Benjamin, they had all worked with DSD patients. So maybe that's part of why they have been so loosey-goosey about messing up somebody's hormone profile.
Yeah, and you can see how appealing it's not only gender is a social construct, but sex is a social construct, how appealing that is in terms of bringing it into the argument. So it's such a fascinating area. And I think with that, relieving your sex drive with testosterone, I mean, something that's quite sad about this is it's kind of opened this can of worms in terms of how we pathologize puberty. And when I was growing up, I certainly struggled with certain pubescent things, and you've touched on some of them. There are others. But the consensus was life is tough, deal with it. It was kind of like, this is something everyone goes through. And a lot of the issues I had, I'd never even discussed with someone, but that wasn't necessarily a bad thing because I always had it in my mind, this is just life. And because it stopped there, I didn't go in, I thought about other things. Whereas if we see a problem and then society saying, oh, well, actually, you can do some stuff about this, then it's going to make us obsess over it even more. So I really think that's a key thing to all this gender stuff is it's like the treatment itself is driving the dysphoria, driving the demand, because when you know that something is available, then you'll think about it more. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I just want to touch on that really quick. You're so right. And I think we cannot discount the impact of, because you're 30, right? So I'm trying to like think timeline wise, when you were a teen, was there social media? Were there these online spaces? But like what young people do now is when they encounter anything baffling whatsoever, they go online and look it up. Yeah. And then they end up in like a Reddit forum or some sort of Discord server. And if you are a boy and you are also swimming in this idea that your sexuality is toxic and dangerous and male sex drive is just an excuse for men to behave badly, like all of these ideas, I think they're valuable for adults to talk about. I'm not saying we shouldn't approach those questions, but if you're just 14 and you're like seeing this stuff, you might also very quickly come to think, I don't want to be associated with that. Like maybe I don't want to be a guy. I mean, how many times have we heard that in kind of like male detransition stories? Like, I don't want to be some oppressive rapist guy. Like, I don't know if you have to bleep that. Sorry. But no, I mean, I know that sounds very overly simplistic, but again, we're talking about the teenage brain, which is overly simplistic. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it's, there are so many cultural forces for both girls and boys that make it really hard for them to understand what I'm going through is natural. It's temporary. Mm-hmm. It's also not the end of the world if I have this thought or that thought. I'm not hurting anyone. Like there's also something today about how there's so many thought crimes. Like you can't think that. You can't say that. You're not allowed to have that question or this idea. Actually, no, like we are really messy. Humans have all kinds of weird thoughts and ideas. So there's just so many things working against a young person who's trying to sort out his sexual orientation, his libido, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, a different set of problems for girls. But since we're focused on males, I just wanted to touch on that as well.
Yeah. So interesting. Well, this conversation has been such a blast, and we've kind of gone down some rabbit holes, but I've really enjoyed it. It just absolutely
Me too.
I just want to finish on, I admire you a lot for being able to be in this conversation so long and stay, like you keep saying, curious and kind of in the gray space, and also being able to have compassion for, I've tried to do the same thing. It's not an absolute situation when it comes to all autogynephiles or all this type or that type. There's true suffering in all of these areas, and there's also true malignance in all these areas too. And being in that space is difficult, as I'm sure you know from, you get it from the trans activists, you get it from the gender critical. You're not going to, satisfy anyone. Where can people go find more of you, Sasha? I know that you have some exciting stuff coming up, which I saw you guys announce on the podcast today. So.
Yeah. So, I mean, my primary place that you can find me is just sashaayad.com. It's my website, which of course gives you information about my parent membership group, where I try to support parents who have gender questioning kids. I have, information about the podcast there. I have a very small YouTube channel. And in our podcast, Gender a Wider Lens, we just announced that our weekly episodes, which have been going on for 4 years now, are coming to a close. But we are kind of shifting gears into these live Substack events that we plan to do once a month, where Stella and I will come together and talk about current events in the gender world. We'll analyze old episodes because we have so many fascinating conversations that we haven't really gotten to slow down and discuss together. And it'll be an opportunity to really connect with more of our listeners and fans of the show. So we will be kind of shifting into our Substack events. And I will be launching a project that I'm really excited about next year called The Metaphor of Gender, where I try to take curiosity and radical acceptance and discuss gender as more of a metaphor than such a tangible, concrete thing. And I'll be using some of the practical therapy things that I've learned over the years working one-on-one with people and putting it into a format for young people who have gender dysphoria, for adults who have transitioned, for parents who are trying to talk to their kids more effectively, and for people like yourself who are just curious about this idea and helping people to be more flexible about their self-concept around identity and their health and their bodies and what to do about things. So I'm really excited to launch The Metaphor of Gender sometime next spring.
Yeah. I'm really excited to check that out because I haven't heard anything like that yet. And I'm looking forward to more non-absolutes and being able to be exploratory. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there's so many people who they don't really buy the extreme trans activism stuff. But then when they hear sometimes, gender critical voices or even some of the cultural critics who kind of make fun of the non-binary blue hair people, they're like, that's mean. I don't want to have people make fun of my purple hair. And I mean, I think it's understandable, but I think there are lots of young people really trying to make sense of themselves, and they're doing the best with the information they have. And I think if we can stay curious and respectful, I think we can help people just have a little more self-compassion. So that's the goal.
I love it. Well, Sasha, thank you so much. It's been great.
Oh, thank you, Jack. I appreciate it.